Let's dim the room and take the long green path in small, careful steps. No rush, no need to catch everything, only what lands quietly. Think of a lantern held low, its circle of light touching moss and stone, a breeze moving the grass in soft ripples. If a memory stirs, let it drift like a leaf on a slow river. If a new detail glows, let it rest, warm and simple. Tonight we aren't chasing bosses or racing the moon. We're letting Hyrule breathe, listening for tiny truths tucked into corners most players pass by. When your eyes grow heavy, that's a kind of save, too. You can always pick up where you left off because these paths have been waiting for years, and they will still be here when morning comes. The name that sits on the box is older than the cartridge that carried it, chosen not for a plot, but for a feeling, a bell-like sound that lingered in the air. Zelda Fitzgerald gave the series its royal, wistful ring, a name that felt like old books and ballroom light, a soft echo from another art. It is fitting, then, that the princess's name came from literature instead of legend, because these games are as much about stories told in the margins as they are about swords drawn in the center. The hero's name is not a boast, but a job description, a little bridge between you and a world that does not speak in your voice. Link is what connects, player to hero, present to past, waking day to a dream with rules of its own. He rarely talks, not because he has nothing to say, but because the path is yours to fill, your breath moving through his quiet shape. Even when the tunic changes color or the model grows older, the idea stays constant. A cord tying you to Hyrule so that your hands can learn its grammar. Most of the time, that cord is left-handed. It's almost invisible until you notice the way he draws a bow or sets his shield. Then one day, the mirror turns and the world flips to meet your swing, a small concession to the living rooms where play happens. In one era, the remote is a sword that prefers the right, so the roads and rivers bend to accommodate it. It's a reminder that games live in bodies, and that sometimes the map shifts to fit the hand holding it. The strange haunted cousin to a sprawling epic was not born from a blank page, but from a practical decision and a bold constraint. A team took the bones of an old adventure and taught them a new mood. Sharper shadows, shorter timelines, masks that borrowed voices and faces. The result felt like a fever dream remembered in the morning. Familiar rooms now tilted, a moon that watched you sleep. It is what happens when tools are reused with different intentions, when a melody is played in a different key at midnight. Before all of this, a symbol traveled across centuries to find a place on a title screen. 3 triangles arranged in a larger triangle, simple, elegant, ancient. The Triforce is both logo and law, design and cosmology, a geometric prayer that fits neatly on a shield or a cliff face. It was not invented from nothing. It was borrowed with reverence, repurposed into a language of power, wisdom, and courage that even players who never read the manuals can feel. The first time the legend reached homes in one country, it slid into a drive and wrote its progress on spinning discs. The first time it reached another, it arrived as a bright gold rectangle with a battery humming quietly inside, holding your place like a patient librarian. 2 paths to the same memory, one saving with magnets, one with a tiny heartbeat, both proving that adventures could continue tomorrow without erasing today. Somewhere in an altar room made for emergencies rather than guests, a blue chamber hides a private joke in a treasure pile. It is a room that stands in for a promise kept to a name plucked from a crowd. A glitch turned into an invitation. A gentle wink from developers to players who press their luck against walls. Find it, and it does not brag. Simply offers rupees and a sign, as if to say that Even accidents can be curated into kindness. In a test map, a little starfighter from another sky once darted and dove so engineers could calibrate pursuit and blast, speed and turn. It never meant to make a cameo, yet it left a tiny footprint in code, proof that worlds inside a studio will occasionally tap shoulders across projects. Enemies learn how to chase by practicing against friends with different jobs, and the final game inherits the grace without the cameo. A man in a very green suit floats into view, his balloon string looped around a wrist that never seems to tire. He loves maps the way others love poetry, and he loves rupees with a zeal that borders on religion. His laugh is a flute and a mosquito, and yet, over time, he becomes more than a gag. He becomes a constant, an odd mirror of the player who also marks the world, who also collects, who also believes that lines on parchment can make sense of mystery. The horse that carries you across the long brown plain takes her name from a goddess whose temples were once carved in stone. It suits her, sure-footed, kind, stubborn in the best way. When you whistle and she comes, the game is telling you something about loyalty that no dialogue could hold, speed that feels like freedom, trust that feels like home. Far to the west, in a land of orange dunes and stone ribs, a people live by rhythms the rest of the map does not hear. Their lore speaks of birth so rare it sounds like a season, a return that upsets the balance while fulfilling it all the same. Culture is explained not in encyclopedias, but in patterns. Markets that open at certain hours, guards who challenge certain faces, a fortress whose walls teach you that stealth is also a kind of power. The written word in Hyrule is not static. It grows and curls, reimagined in each era, as if the world keeps finding new ways to draw the same thought. Players with patience can translate signs into something legible, and when they do, they discover the delight of a joke hidden in plain sight, a menu that admits what it is, a warning that smiles. Alphabets become bridges, letting you feel that even in a world built from code, the texture of language matters. On a late night, after hours when the office had emptied and the city outside was mostly hum, a handful of people kept playing with tools they already knew. A side project became an island that was not fully real, an adventure that treated the hero's memories like clouds. It is a reminder that sometimes the best ideas enter sideways, not through a plan, but through a dare. What if we made it a dream that remembered it was a dream? There is a sword that is more than a blade, a promise slept into metal and woken by a touch. When you find it nestled in the forest, light falls on it like a ceremony without witnesses. Later games will give it names and histories, trials and voices. At first, it is simply there, planted like a standard in a grove, proof that certain artifacts can carry meaning across decades without ever needing to explain themselves. 3 names, short, bright, and round in the mouth, settle into a triangle of their own. 1 lays earth, 1 pours wisdom, 1 kindles flame. The series will use these syllables like recurring chords, sometimes as goddesses, sometimes as the titles of games, sometimes as the colors on a menu. The pattern is the point, a myth you can hum. 2 adventures released as a pair are built to speak to each other, trading secrets through strings of symbols. Passwords act like letters between twins, updating one world with events from another, unlocking a final meeting that feels like a handshake held a little longer. In an era before online patches and cloud saves, this was its own kind of network, a quiet corridor where events echoed across cartridges. An adventure in cooperative clothing splits a single hero into 4 hues and asks you to be a team inside one body. Puzzles that look simple alone reveal extra layers when pulled in opposite directions. When switches are pressed in a rhythm, you learn together. It's a good-natured reminder that even in a legend built around one name, there are times when being many is the trick. On one journey, pendants represent a path walked. On another, medallions testify to friendships forged, while spells borrow older names. It is a tidy taxonomy that makes the world feel ordered without ever saying it out loud. You learn the split by playing. These stand for people. Those stand for power. When ritual and relationship are both honored, the map reads like a storybook with tabs. An expansion once promised more to a world already wide, a plan to layer new tricks on familiar hills. The hardware shifted, and the plan folded into other shapes. But ghost DNA lingers. Alternate dungeons, inverted riddles, the sense that you are charting a parallel Hyrule drawn with different pen strokes. In this way, even cancellations can seed futures. 3 days repeat, not as punishment, but as a metronome. Dawn breaks, noon arrives, dusk leans in, and you begin to understand that routine can be refuge. You make schedules, keep promises, learn that kindness is also a timer you set. When the final morning comes and everything is in place, it is not victory that feels best. It is the sudden stillness of a town finally at peace. Breathe once, slowly, as if you're letting a paper lantern go. The path ahead is quieter still, written not in maps but in notes, humming through fields and stone halls alike. A song mapped to buttons turns a controller into an instrument that remembers your fingers better than your mind. The scale isn't complete the way a piano is, yet the melodies feel whole because the game meets you halfway. You do not need to read music to feel the joy of wind and rain lifting under your thumbs. There is a tune that feeds on itself, taught by a man embittered by a melody you will bring him later. Time loops, and so does the music, a paradox that somehow feels like justice. You enter a windmill and leave with a storm in your pocket, the past corrected by the future, both swaying to the same rhythm. For a while, a chant in a temple sounded like prayers captured from a faraway place. The world is full of echoes, and sometimes echoes cause hurt when no harm was meant. Later versions swapped the sample for something neutral, a small edit that kept the sense of heat and reverence without borrowing a voice that wasn't offered. Symbols changed, too, when artists noticed that what was once a flourish can look like a wound. A mark on a banner becomes a new shape, similar in spirit, but softer on the eyes that might read it with a different history. It's proof that fantasy is not exempt from care, that respect can be patched in like a line of better code. On a sea painted like a moving storybook, thick ink lines rise and fall with the waves, and shadows feel like brushstrokes drying in the sun. Some players balked at first, expecting grit and getting glow. Years passed, and the glow became the point, rendering the adventure less vulnerable to the slow dates of technology and more loyal to mood. On that same sea, you don't just play notes, you conduct them. The baton is not a flute or a harp, but a wand that draws patterns in the air, your wrist sketching wind the way a sailor reads clouds. Music becomes navigation, not a solo, but a dialogue with the horizon. A simple notebook turns strangers into a timetable of kindness. People once marked as quest givers become neighbors with routines and dreams, and you learn that the real dungeon in a town is rarely underground. It is the calendar. Check a box at the right minute, and a grief eases. Miss it, and you promise to return 2 days earlier next time. Stones that hum in corners speak if you strike them or stare long enough. They keep time, complain about weather, joke about boots. They are comic relief dressed as architecture, part oracle, part kettle on the boil, and they help a world feel peopled even in places where no one lives. A field theme swells and thins as you travel, adding drums when danger nears, easing back to strings when the sky widens. The music watches you the way a companion might, tense when you run, relieved when you're safe, quietly proud when you solve something tricky. Dynamic scores taught a generation that a soundtrack can be a living thing. In a later age, pianos arrive like dew. Notes spaced so far apart the silence becomes a chorus of its own. The land itself seems to compose, fine as frost, letting bird calls and footsteps write counterpoint. It is the sound of a map that doesn't need to shout to be heard. A scarecrow in a riverside shack asks you for a personal melody, and when you give him one, the world remembers it. Your private tune becomes a key that opens ledges and perches where no standard song could help. The game hands you authorship and grins when you use it to cheat a climb. Dances and lullabies carry names that sound like bedtime stories. A sun coaxed to rise by a child with a whistle. Time spun backward with a sigh. None of these tunes are complicated. They are small and direct, because magic in this world favors clarity. The lesson is gentle. Simple patterns, faithfully kept, can move the heavens. Listen closely, and you notice that sound designers give chests a breath, and switches a click that feels older than technology. A metal latch sighs with history as if 100 hands have opened it before. The creak of a bridge is the narration you didn't know you needed. An audio footnote telling you this place exists beyond your visit. Voice work grows in from the edges. Groans, gasps, giggles, and the occasional lyric phrase carry more story than paragraphs could. A laugh tells you more about a shopkeeper than a speech ever would. A single exhale on a cliff top after a sprint becomes an admission that the journey has weight. Ocean breezes whisper under melodies when sails fill, and rain stitches tiny needles into the fabric of a forest's quiet. Waterfalls purr rather than roar, tuned to be cozy in headphones at midnight. A world designed for 10-minute bursts also knows how to cradle you for hours. Localization turns puns into new jokes rather than literal ones, keeps warmth where straight translation would leave a draft. Names shift slightly so they ring in the ear without snagging. A culture can cross oceans if you let it put on a coat that suits the weather where it lands. The sound of a ferry is a chime that lives in the back of your head long after you've turned off the screen. The whoosh of a boomerang is a feel-good loop, as satisfying on the 100th throw as on the first. These are tiny rewards, not for winning, but for doing. And they train the hand to trust that the world will always answer kindly. Breathe again, deeper this time, like you're letting a raft drift until the current chooses. The next stretch is about tools and rooms, the objects you carry and the places that make them sing. A spinning blade on a string is the first lesson, arcs and return, teaching you that distance can be brief if designed correctly. Long before advanced physics systems, the boomerang explains cause and effect better than a lecture. You throw it because it feels good. You learn because it insists on coming back. A hook with a chain tells a different truth. The gaps aren't always gaps, and sometimes the space between 2 points is a hidden door. The exact sound of it clamping into wood is as much part of its pleasure as the sudden lurch forward. When later versions split it into 2 claws, the principle remains. You're stitching the map together with metal thread. Masks are not costumes here, but verbs. Put one on, and your bones remember different shapes. your feet different rhythms. Suddenly, water is home, spikes are shoes, flowers are elevators. The items are stories about identity, told without speeches, a children's book about empathy written in controls. A bottle is never just a bottle. It is a traveling shrine for light, a pantry for potions, a net for insects, a vessel for wishes. This humble glass loop is often the most useful thing you own, simply because it says yes to so many small needs. In a game filled with legendary weapons, the bottle teaches abundance through simplicity. Some puzzles respect maps, others respect clocks. A block that moves only a certain number of squares is a contract you sign with geometry. A puzzle that must be done before dusk is a promise you make to time. Together they train your patience into a tool, turning the player into someone who notices. Stamina is a soft boundary that politely asks you to rest. Run too long, and your breath becomes the game's breath. A shared panning that makes the next pause feel earned. Climb until your fingers weaken, and you begin to plan instead of lunge, tracing routes with your eyes before committing your hands. Weapons that wear out are not a punishment. They are a reminder that improvisation can be a joy. When a favorite breaks, you look around with fresh hunger, seeing world objects as potential tools. A tree branch is no longer scenery, it is a plan. Rods that bend fire are not just damage dealers, they are pencils drawing new borders in a fight. Freeze a path and a lake becomes a staircase. Shock a puddle, and the ground becomes a warning. Elemental logic invites you to think of the environment as a partner. Warp tools are a promise that the game respects your time, but the way they are given matters. Sometimes they are a dignified gift from a guardian after a test. Sometimes they are a feather you earn by listening to a harp. What they always do is turn long walks into chosen walks, and that is a kindness. A little bird-like friend in a pot is a joke and a miracle. It lets you step outside a dungeon to catch your breath, to buy milk, to call a friend, then step back in as if nothing happened. The best quality of life features dress themselves in charm so they never feel clinical. Magnetism makes the invisible visible, painting the world with outlines you can tug. Suddenly, you aren't just exploring. You are curating, rearranging a ruin into a staircase, a junkyard into a ladder. The clink of a heavy slab landing exactly where you wanted it is its own lullaby. Runes or songs that stop time admit that even clocks can be tools, their hands bent for a moment to serve a clean line. Freeze a boulder mid-roll, and you have purchased a second chance with wit. The echoing thunk that follows is as musical as any theme. Light reflected from a mirror shield is more than a mechanic. It's a metaphor. You learn to aim without striking, to solve without cutting. Dungeons often teach mercy under the guise of physics, inviting you to bounce rather than break. Bombs with a timer were once little heartbeats in your pocket, a counting game that taught risk. Later, remote triggers turn them into polite helpers who wait for your nod. The shift is small but meaningful. The difference between juggling and arranging. Keys shaped like skeleton smiles remind you that doors lock not to frustrate but to pace. A dungeon is a story with punctuation marks you must earn. Open a big one, and the chess music writes an exclamation point without ever needing to shout. Maps that draw themselves as you walk imply a mutual trust. The game agrees to remember for you if you agree to explore for it. Compass needles tell you where happiness probably is, but never how to get there. That is your part of the bargain, and keeping it makes the reward feel rightful. A grappling leaf you spin above your head is a physics lesson, cloaked as a toy. Catch the air right, and you drift. Catch it wrong, and you learn. The correction is not punishment, only a gentle nudge to notice wind as a real thing instead of a texture. Boots that slip on ice and boots that stick to walls are small essays about friction and faith. Put them on, and suddenly surfaces are opinions, not facts. The angle of your run matters. The tilt of your plan matters more. A lantern in a cave is the original patch note. It expands your world by inches, not miles, teaching attentiveness with every step. The way moths love it is both warning and wonder, a tiny ecosystem that exists only because you dared to bring light into dark. Breathe once more, as if you are watching dust motes spin in a sunbeam from a temple skylight. We drift now toward people and the gentle strangeness of their histories. High in the sky, a people with feathered cloaks learn their letters from a dragon who perches like a lighthouse. In one flooded timeline, legends suggest they could be cousins of those who once loved water more than air. Evolution here is less textbook than poem, a suggestion carried on sea wind rather than a decree etched in stone. In a forest that feels like a childhood kept alive, small wooden spirits scatter seed puffs as they giggle and hide. Long before they wore leaves for hair, they were children who never risked growing tall because the world asked them to guard rather than to wander. Their new forms are lighter, but their watchfulness remains. A clan in shadow sets red eyes on the world and keeps it safe in ways the day doesn't always applaud. Technology in their vaults looks like ancient magic, gears and screens wrapped in prayer. When a branch of the same family grows bitter and turns their symbol upside down, you learn that even in legends, dissent can become doctrine. A princess's attendant is never a mere title. It is a role that reincarnates in every era as if loyalty itself has a soul. Sometimes the attendant is old, sometimes thin as a reed, sometimes stern, sometimes mischievous, but always a compass that points the hero home. The consistency comforts more than any stat boost. A vendor who wheels his shop across eras arrives with a smile that seems to remember you even if he shouldn't. He offers beetles with names and arrows with discounts, like they are gifts rather than goods. The truth is simple. A world with an honest shopkeeper feels kinder than one without. A scientist who looks like a child because a machine misfired chirps orders at researchers twice her apparent age. She names her devices with sing-song syllables and treats great mysteries like puzzles for a lazy afternoon. In her, the series finds a way to laugh at the weight of its own lore without diminishing it. A musician with a concertina and a memory for storms teaches you that songs can be maps. He perches on cliffs and under the ribs of skeletons, and every time you find him, the view is worth the climb. He is both reward and wayfinder, his feathers trembling when a story lands. A giant with maracas asks for seeds and returns dances that feel like rain on tin roofs. The inventory expands and you exhale, grateful not because you own more, but because your pockets feel like they finally match your curiosity. His laughter turns organization into celebration. A mask is carved not to hide, but to reveal what someone needs. A dancer who cannot stop moving, even in a graveyard, proves that stories about the dead can be affectionate rather than morbid. The way villagers talk about him, half teasing, half awed, teaches you that legends are often the town's way of admiring its own strangeness. A stone-skinned elder speaks slowly, rolling consonants like rocks in a stream, and behind his voice is a lullaby that sounds like a hearth deeper than any mine. He explains food as ritual and wrestling as respect, and if you pay attention, you learn more about community here than in any lecture hall. A queen of a river people wears sorrow like a crown and her song turns water to glass. When you finally hear it fully, the melody feels less like performance and more like geography. Part of the river's shape as much as its banks. Music in this series is often biography, a way to tell you who someone is without saying it. A thief who runs like a gust grants you a boomerang once he understands that speed without purpose is just weather. He is not cruel. He is restless, and the game forgives him the way a small town forgives a boy who grows too fast. Lessons here stick because they're delivered with kindness. A rival with a pompadour struts into a story that might have been grim and brightens it with bravado. He is a bully on page 1 and a friend by the credits, proof that character arcs can act like bridges where players expect walls. The hair is a joke. The growth is the point. A monarch of Twilight hides her face not out of shame but as strategy, a way to move through a world that misunderstands her. When the veil lifts, beauty is not the surprise. Fierce tenderness is. Companions in these games are not sidekicks. They are counter-melodies, and she is one of the loveliest. A sword remembers you. It hums softly near certain enemies as if to warn or welcome, its old spirit peeking through new mechanics. In a particularly quiet moment, you might feel that the metal itself is relieved to be useful again, to be held by someone who listens. A tree that is more than a tree waits across multiple lives, his bark creased with the kind of smile only centuries can shape. He speaks slowly, sometimes in riddles, sometimes in fatherly advice, and the forest seems to breathe with him. When seeds fall around him like confetti, the world feels newborn. A farm girl whose lullaby tames the wildest foal teaches you that care is a mechanic. She is drawn like a sunbeam and written like a breeze, and the fields around her look better when she is standing in them. Not all helpers wield weapons. Some carry melodies and milk. A guard who looks suspiciously like a different famous plumber stands outside a ranch scowling, his mustache as much a character as his scowl. These little winks make the world feel like a neighborhood where creators live on the same street and borrow sugar. A mask salesman who smiles too wide tells you more with a bow than some kings do with decrees. He is polite, alarming, generous, and unnerving, all at once. He trusts you, then vanishes, leaving you to wonder if trust was the only item in his pack that mattered. A collector on a bridge at night pays handsomely for the oddest parts of enemies, giggling at your haul as if the bones tell jokes. He is half merchant, half folklorist, and his tent feels like a traveling museum, curated by a child who never lost his love for the spooky. A painter sets up an easel in a village that smells of cooking roofs after rain. He studies apple trees like they're cathedrals and asks you to share your favorite views. Photography would be literal. His work is slower, and the game respects that slowness enough to reward it. A scholar in a tall hat records sightings of dragons that glide like rivers in the sky. He measures myth with ink and patience, and in helping him you realize that cataloging wonder does not diminish it. If anything, it multiplies because shared awe is larger than private astonishment. Breathe here and let the night outside your window listen with you. If you're still awake, we can keep walking. If not, Hyrule will wait, steady as a heartbeat, until you open your eyes again. One curious detail that fans often overlook is the way the Legend of Zelda, Twilight Princess, reintroduces the concept of goats as important to the village economy. At first glance, this may seem trivial, but it is an echo of how the series often grounds its fantastical hero in small, almost mundane responsibilities before thrusting him into destiny. The goat herding minigame in Orden Village reflects more than just filler. It ties Link's role to his community, showing that before saving kingdoms, he is expected to contribute to the rhythms of rural life. What deepens the obscurity is that the goat herding mechanic was actually built as a stress test for the horseback controls, meaning something technical evolved into a subtle piece of narrative grounding. Another small, almost invisible touch in the Zelda timeline can be found in the Minish Cap. When Link receives the ability to shrink, he discovers hidden Picori doorways scattered across Hyrule. The placement of these doors isn't random. They often align with places of cultural or historical weight, implying that the Minish themselves influenced the growth of Hylian civilization by leaving behind miniature access points to sacred or meaningful areas. This recontextualizes the entire kingdom. Hyrule is not purely a human achievement, but one subtly scaffolded by tiny, unseen helpers who chose not to reveal themselves broadly. The fact that the Minish tradition is almost never mentioned in later games suggests their influence is meant to be a secret history, remembered only by the attentive. In Ocarina of Time, many remember the gossip stones scattered around Hyrule, but few realize just how much coded information they contain. Striking them with different items produces unique behaviors, explosions with bombs, dancing with certain weapons, and each behavior corresponds to hidden developer notes about testing hit detection and object responses. Beyond their comedic role, they act as a developer's diary hidden in plain sight, showing how mechanics were stress-tested. The lore twist is that gossip stones are tied to the Sheikah, meaning the developers embedded their technical debug tools as a Sheikah cultural artifact. This deliberate blending of narrative and necessity creates a strange harmony where in-universe mysticism overlaps with real-world coding experiments. Wind Waker holds a charming obscurity in the way its great sea is dotted with fishmen who eagerly sketch maps for Link. Most players remember their chatter as silly and their maps as useful, but few stop to notice that these fishmen effectively preserve the cartographic memory of Hyrule. Since the kingdom was drowned, the fishmen became the lore keepers, drawing crude yet functional representations of islands. The obscure twist is that their manner of communication, half riddle, half gossip, echoes the Sheikah gossip stones, suggesting that these wandering fish are filling the role of a lost information network. They are the last historians of a drowned kingdom, and their scratchy maps are the remnants of a lost art of recording the world. The Legend of Zelda, Majora's Mask, hides one of its most unsettling details in the way time resets. Characters relive the same 3 days endlessly, yet subtle hints show they retain faint echoes of past cycles. For instance, certain villagers display emotions or anxieties that don't fully match their scripted circumstances, as if they subconsciously know disaster is looming. This eerie mechanic, though partly an illusion created by player memory, has textual grounding. Tidal comments more than once that things feel strangely familiar, implying that time itself isn't a clean slate, but a blurred repetition. The obscurity lies in how this creates a metaphysical horror. Termina's citizens are trapped in a time fracture, where memory and fate bleed together, unable to fully escape the shadow of the falling moon. In Link's Awakening, the windfish's dream is famously fragile, but tucked away is an obscure detail about the owl who guides Link. The owl isn't simply a wise spirit. In Japanese development notes, he is considered an embodiment of the windfish's own subconscious. This means every cryptic clue the owl delivers is essentially the dreamer guiding itself toward awakening. It reframes the owl not as a mentor, but as a psychological mechanism, ensuring the dream ends correctly. This subtle lore layer means Link's journey isn't just an adventure inside someone else's dream, but a walk through the very mind of the Windfish, where guidance is self-generated. Twilight Princess contains a small yet haunting touch with the resistance group in Castletown. Each member is a faded reflection of older Zelda archetypes. The swordsman recalls Impa's protective role, the scholar recalls Sahasrara, and the beast tamer recalls the wandering druids of older lore. Most players see them as background characters, but they embody the idea that Hyrule's memory of heroes has been diluted over centuries. Instead of singular legends like Link or Zelda, there are fragments of archetypes scattered among ordinary people, hinting at a kingdom that clings to echoes of past greatness, but can no longer manifest them in full. This obscurity deepens the sense that Hyrule is always living in the shadow of its mythic history. A Link Between Worlds quietly introduces a startling piece of world building, the concept of Hyrule, a parallel kingdom whose Triforce was destroyed by its own rulers. This is not simply a mirror for Hyrule, but a cautionary tale about misusing divine gifts. What many overlook is that Hyrule's citizens exhibit behaviors and values slightly twisted from their Hyrulean counterparts, suggesting that the destruction of the Triforce didn't just remove divine order, but altered cultural development. The obscurity here is that Hyrule is the only world in Zelda where destiny feels fractured and chaotic, underscoring the series' recurring theme that power must exist in balance, lest society itself unravel. Breath of the Wild contains a deeply hidden system tied to its dragons. When the dragons Farosh, Naydra, and Dinraal appear, they shed scales and other materials that can be used in cooking or shrine access. Yet few players pause to realize these dragons are not simply beasts. Their looping flight paths mirror the ley lines of Hyrule's geography. Their movements carve invisible circuits across the land, almost like guardians of magical currents. Developers confirmed that these paths were carefully mapped to flow along mountain ridges and rivers, subtly implying that the dragons are regulating the lifeblood of the world. This means their presence isn't ornamental, it's ecological, tying mythic beings into the literal energy grid of Hyrule. Wave 6 begins with the subtle kind of obscurity that feels almost like a dream drifting between layers of memory and invention. A wave that doesn't rush forward, but instead laps slowly against the shore of Zelda's long history, carrying hidden curiosities as if they were shells polished by time. There is something special about the facts that fit here. Less about grand events and more about tiny details tucked into code, shadows of unused design, quiet NPC moments, and faint musical whispers that many never hear. These are the things that keep a series alive in the imagination, the kind of details you carry with you as you close your eyes, soft enough to guide you toward sleep, strange enough to linger like fragments of forgotten adventures. One obscurity that often gets overlooked lies in the nature of the Kokiri from Ocarina of Time. Most remember them as eternal children, beings who never grow old so long as they remain within the forest. But hidden in the Japanese instruction manual is a line that suggests their physical forms were never meant to resemble children at all. Instead, they were originally described as spirits that took on small, childlike shapes, simply so that Link could understand them. This detail was dropped in the English localization, but it implies something uncanny, that the Kokiri may only appear to Link in forms he can recognize. Their true essence might be far more abstract, entities of pure spirit woven into the bark of the great Deku tree. Falling asleep with this thought can make you imagine the forest itself whispering in the voice of children, disguising its mysteries so that a young hero would not be afraid. Majora's Mask deepens this kind of mystery with its relationship to transformation masks. While most players know each mask contains the spirit of a fallen being, a detail buried in the game's text reveals that the Goron mask actually murmurs faint sounds of Darunia's ancestor when pressed against Link's face. This sound is so quiet it blends with the rumble of the transformation sequence, but careful listeners with headphones have claimed to detect faint cries that almost sound like distant prayers. Developers have never confirmed this, but the belief persists that each mask contains echoes of its spirit, murmurs layered into the sound design itself. It gives the already haunting transformation cutscenes a new weight, as if Link is not just wearing a mask, but momentarily carrying the grief and essence of the fallen. In a bedtime telling, that becomes something dreamlike, as though when you wear another's face, you feel their story press gently into your skin. Breath of the Wild contains an obscure quirk tied to its weather system that feels almost too human to be a coincidence. Most players understand that storms can roll in unpredictably, but few realize that the game's code contains what fans call emotional weighting, a mechanic where storms are statistically more likely to appear in certain areas after key story events. For example, after Link learns about the tragedy of Mipha, some zones near Zora's domain experience slightly more rainstorms than usual. It is a subtle atmospheric tweak, not enough to guarantee rain, but enough to skew the mood of the environment toward gloom. Developers never announced this, and it took data miners years to confirm. To fall asleep to that thought is to picture the game itself mourning quietly, its skies weeping more often when sorrow has been spoken aloud. Sometimes obscurity hides not in lore, but in technical trickery. In Twilight Princess, the designers struggled to render the vast Faron Woods on the GameCube's limited hardware. Their solution was to place invisible fog walls that constantly moved with the camera, giving the illusion that mist was swirling naturally. What few players realize is that the fog was actually a textured sphere wrapped around Link at all times, meaning the mist was not part of the world, but part of Link's perspective. In other words, the fog belonged to him, not to the land. Thinking of it this way, you might imagine the fog as a metaphor for perception itself. Each of us carrying a sphere of haze, a personal atmosphere that blurs the world beyond our immediate view. Another detail worth lingering on comes from the Minish Cap. Deep within the game's files is unused dialogue for Eslo, the talking cap, that reveals he once had a slightly darker personality. Some of these lines suggest that he would have teased Link cruelly, commenting on his failures with biting humor. The localization team softened him, reshaping Eslo into a grumpy but lovable companion. Yet in those cut lines, preserved only in text dumps, he feels sharper, even bitter, as though his transformation into a cap had left scars not visible in the final game. This unused personality creates a strange parallel version of the adventure, one where companionship is tinged with resentment, and the guidance Link receives is laced with passive-aggressive reminders of mistakes. To imagine this as you rest is to picture two voices layered together, the official Eslo guiding with grumbles, and the ghostly Eslo mocking with cruelty, both forever stitched into the same hat. In Wind Waker, the Endless Sea carries countless small curiosities, but among the strangest is a detail about seagulls. If you follow a group of seagulls far enough, They sometimes lead you not to treasure or enemies, but to blank spots of ocean where nothing exists. For years, players debated whether this was a glitch or intentional design, and eventually it was revealed that the seagulls were programmed with semi-randomized destinations, meaning they sometimes wander to places that serve no purpose at all. Yet for players who spent hours following them, these empty destinations became myths in themselves, spots of ocean whispered to contain hidden secrets, phantom islands that never materialize. To think of that now in the quiet of night is to imagine being led endlessly toward horizons that never resolve, a dream of chasing birds across waters that never give answers. Zelda 2 hides an obscurity not in its world, but in its difficulty system. Many players know it as one of the hardest games in the series, but within its coding exists an unused mechanic where the game would have adapted to player skill. Early development documents show notes about enemies scaling differently, depending on how often Link died, a system meant to soften the blows for struggling players. This mechanic was never implemented, likely abandoned due to technical limits, but its ghost remains in partial code fragments. To know this is to see Zelda 2 in a new light, not purely punishing, but once imagined as a world that might have bent gently for the weary. As you drift toward sleep, it becomes a comforting thought that even the harshest adventures sometimes carry the idea of mercy hidden beneath their surfaces. Another secret hides in Oracle of Ages, where one NPC in Lina City has dialogue that changes depending on the time of day in real life. Few players ever noticed because the Game Boy Color lacked an internal clock, meaning the only way to trigger it was through external accessories or emulation quirks. This hidden text, nearly impossible to see under normal play, suggests the developers once planned for a more time-sensitive world, one that would mirror the passage of time outside the game. It is as if Hyrule wanted to synchronize itself with the real world, aligning its day with ours. To imagine this while resting is to picture two clocks ticking together, your own and the one inside a cartridge, beating in hidden harmony. Phantom Hourglass contains an eerie, little-known fact about the Temple of the Ocean King. Beyond the well-known mechanic of its draining curse, the temple's music actually layers new instruments the deeper you go. By the lowest floors, the melody contains haunting undertones absent from the beginning, as though the dungeon itself gains a voice more sinister with each descent. This detail is rarely noticed because players are often rushing through under pressure. But when slowed down and listened to, the gradual corruption of the theme becomes chilling. It feels like the dungeon itself is aware of your presence, its song warping as it anticipates your exhaustion. Falling asleep, you can imagine the sound of stone halls humming lullabies that turn darker the longer you linger. Spirit Tracks continues this tradition with its train maps. The lines on the map, while designed for gameplay, actually form rough outlines of constellations from the night sky when connected in certain ways. It is not officially confirmed if this was deliberate, but fans who overlay the maps with star charts have noted uncanny similarities. Perhaps it is coincidence, or perhaps the developers wove cosmic echoes into the rails themselves. To carry this into rest is to imagine the train not just moving across Hyrule, but tracing the heavens, drawing star lines across the world with every whistle. And at the edges of this wave, there is the legend of unused bosses. In Ocarina of Time's files rests the infamous Arwing, a test enemy imported directly from Star Fox to test aerial combat mechanics. Many know of its existence, but fewer realize that developers briefly considered leaving it as a hidden Easter egg. They ultimately removed it, fearing it would break the world's tone, but its presence lingers as a bridge between series. To dream on this fact is to imagine Link staring skyward, shield raised, as space skirts this craft wheel above the fields of Hyrule, blending myth and machinery in surreal harmony. Wave 6 in this expanded telling becomes not just a collection of curiosities, but a tide of half-hidden truths, some whispered by developers, some uncovered by data miners, some imagined into myth by players who saw something strange and never forgot it. Each detail carries the same rhythm, a fragment of obscurity that invites you to rest upon it like driftwood, to let the mind wander across seas of forgotten code and half-buried lore. These are the details that feel most like dreams themselves, fleeting, puzzling, often unnoticed, yet lingering with a strange kind of comfort. And as this wave rolls back into the night, it leaves behind the soft hush of mysteries unsolved, perfect companions to the quiet of sleep. Wave 7 comes with the slow rhythm of twilight, that time when the sky is neither day nor night, but somewhere in between, a kind of atmosphere that Majora's Mask captures so well with its strange melancholy. Obscure Zelda facts within this wave lean into the surreal, the half-hidden truths that feel almost like accidents of coding or whispers from designers who left tiny signatures behind. These are not the big stories that everyone remembers, but the quiet ones, the small anomalies, the glimmers of something mysterious that might otherwise pass unnoticed. They are the kinds of things that, when spoken softly, can guide you deeper into that liminal space where sleep meets imagination. One of the strangest obscurities comes from the way Majora's Mask handles its masks when Link transforms. Most players see it as an instantaneous shift. One moment Link wears the mask, the next he becomes a new form. But in the game's code, the transformation is treated as a series of painful animations strung together in an almost grotesque sequence, only partially visible to the player. Debug tools reveal frames of Link's body twisting unnaturally, stretched and contorted into shapes that the final cutscenes never show. It suggests that each transformation is far more disturbing than the game lets on, and what we see is a softened version of something truly uncanny. To rest with this thought is to imagine the dreamlike sensation of wearing someone else's body, of your own form, bending into shapes it was never meant to hold. Another obscure curiosity emerges from Ocarina of Time's Shadow Temple. While most players remember the eerie atmosphere of that dungeon, very few know that the chanting sound in the background was altered between regions. In the Japanese and European versions of the game, the chanting was a direct recording of Islamic prayer, unintentionally included from a sound library. When this was discovered, it was replaced with a different ambient track for the American release. The result is that the Shadow Temple feels subtly different, depending on where in the world you played it. To imagine this is to picture the same cavern whispering different songs in different languages, a reminder that Hyrule itself changes shape across borders. There is also an obscurity in the original Legend of Zelda, where one of the enemies, the Paul's voice, was said in the manual to fear loud noises. On the Famicom disk system in Japan, this was literal. The Paul's voice could be defeated by players blowing into the microphone attached to the second controller. But in other regions, where no microphone existed, the instruction remained, leaving players utterly confused. It created a generation of children who spent hours trying to use the whistle item or other tricks, never realizing the truth was hardware-specific. This detail shows how a single design choice, tied to technology, can create legends and myths around an enemy that seemed unsolvable. Drifting into sleep with that story, you can almost hear faint echoes of children blowing into microphones in faraway living rooms, their breath carrying into the world of Hyrule like spells. Wind Waker hides something equally strange in its figurine gallery. While most players recognize the fun of collecting enemy and character statues, very few know that one of the figurines has dialogue tied to it that references an NPC who does not actually exist in the game. It's a phantom remnant, a leftover of a cut character who was meant to play a role in Windfall Island's story. When players read the figurine's text carefully, they can see it describing interactions that never occur anywhere else, as though the figurine remembers a ghost of the past. To imagine this at night is to think of statues whispering about people who never were, fragments of history frozen in porcelain. Twilight Princess offers its own hidden quirk in the form of Ilia's memory loss. Most players remember that she forgets Link early in the story and slowly regains her recollection. But within the game's script, files are alternate versions of her recovery scenes, suggesting the developers considered multiple paths to her regaining her memory. In one version, she recalls him suddenly after seeing Epona, while in another she only begins to piece things together after hearing the howl of Link in wolf form. The version we play is a smoother narrative, but the unused variations hint that Ilia's amnesia was once meant to be a branching storyline. It shows how much of storytelling is decided in the cutting room, and it leaves behind a dreamlike sense of possibilities. How many versions of Ilia exist, scattered across scrapped drafts? A Link to the Past carries a subtle but eerie obscurity in its light world and dark world structure. Players understand that the two realms mirror one another, but there is one house in Kakariko Village that does not line up with anything in the dark world. Instead of a mirrored counterpart, the location is replaced with a patch of empty space. Some fans have speculated this was an oversight, but others believe it was intentional, a suggestion that not everything in the light has a shadow, that some plies are too pure or too fragile to survive in the reflection. It becomes almost a philosophical question. Why does one house resist the symmetry? Drifting toward sleep, it's comforting to imagine that even in the darkest reflections, there are places untouched by shadow. Breath of the Wild introduces another obscurity that feels alive with personality if you leave raw meat in snowy regions for long enough. Wolves will appear to sniff and eventually take it, reducing the item from the map. This mechanic is not explained anywhere in the game and is so subtle that many players never notice it. It is as if the wilderness has its own life, reacting not just to the hero but to the things he leaves behind. It blurs the line between a game mechanic and a natural ecosystem. As a bedtime image, you can picture wolves creeping quietly into camp, while Link sleeps, carrying away the offerings he unknowingly left. In Link's Awakening, there is an obscure detail about the windfish's egg. If you circle the egg on certain paths before unlocking it properly, the game triggers sound effects that mimic the whispers of dungeons. These effects are coded as minor sound tests, yet they play only when players trace the patterns of the real solution. It's as though the egg itself hums in recognition when someone stumbles upon the secret path early. This detail makes the egg feel alive, not just a static object, but something aware of the world around it. Imagine drifting into dreams and hearing faint murmurs from a great egg in the sky, waiting for you to trace its lines before it will hatch into song. Oracle of Seasons carries another obscurity hidden in its animal companions. Most players choose between Moosh, Dimitri, or Ricky, but data mine text reveals that a fourth companion was once planned, a bird-like creature that could carry Link over obstacles. It was cut from the final game, leaving only traces in the files. Thinking about this lost bird companion, you can almost imagine a version of the story where Link soared over rivers and valleys, not with Musha's wings or Dimitri's swim, but on the back of a forgotten friend. It's a comforting thought that somewhere in the corners of the code there are creatures who almost lived, who might still be waiting in hidden lines of programming. Even Hyrule Warriors, a spin-off, contains obscure details that link back to the main series. Some of the weapon descriptions in that game use poetic language recycled directly from Japanese strategy guides for older Zelda titles. These phrases were never translated into English before, meaning Hyrule Warriors quietly carries bits of official lore that the West never saw. To know this is to see the game as more than just a flashy spin-off, but as vessel carrying fragments of hidden history, passing them forward like heirlooms across generations. Phantom Hourglass hides a gentle obscurity in the form of Linebeck's journal. While most players focus on his humorous cowardice, unused text in the game's files reveals more of his inner thoughts, including moments where he admits deep guilt over selfish decisions. These lines were cut, leaving him a more comedic character, but their existence means that his role was once envisioned as more tragic. Thinking of this as you fall asleep is to imagine a brash sailor who hides a private diary, a book of secrets he never shares, quietly tucked away in the corners of the sea. Spirit Tracks, meanwhile, contains a detail about Zelda's phantom form. If you leave her idle for long enough, she hums to herself. But the melody she hums is not random. It is a slowed-down version of her own theme from the earliest Zelda games. It's so subtle that many dismiss it as generic humming, yet careful listeners know it's a nod to her musical heritage. This tiny act makes her feel more alive, as though even in ghostly form she carries her memories as music. To drift into sleep is to hear Zelda humming softly somewhere in the distance, a lullaby only spirits remember. And then there are the myths that players create when confronted with half-finished ideas. In the files of Ocarina of Time, unused medallions exist that suggest dungeons were planned for light, wind, and ice. These medallions were ultimately left with no purpose, but their presence has inspired decades of speculation. Players imagine what those temples might have been like, designing entire dungeons in their dreams. It shows how even absence can create lore, that sometimes what is missing is just as powerful as what is present. To rest on this thought is to imagine endless doors sealed shut, each leading to a temple that only exists in dreams. Wave 7, in its fullness, becomes a tide of forgotten fragments, eerie shadows, hidden sounds, cut characters, and speculative myths. It is a wave built not of mainline memories, but of strange side paths, passages hidden in the code, and in the collective imagination of fans who notice too much. Each of these details feels like a whisper, too quiet for the waking mind, but perfect for the drifting one, carrying the listener further into the fog of sleep. The obscurity itself becomes a lullaby. Each fact, another note in a song that echoes faintly across Hyrule's countless incarnations, guiding you toward rest with mysteries that will never be fully solved. Wave 8 drifts in like a final song at twilight, carrying with it some of the most hidden, unusual, and quietly fascinating details of the Zelda universe. These facts linger at the edges of development history, design quirks, strange characters, and faint echoes of ideas that were almost lost to time. As you listen, Let each paragraph unfold like the turning of an ancient page, not numbered, but flowing one into the next, as if the story itself has always been waiting for you. There is a quiet charm in knowing that Ocarina of Time once had a far larger expansion planned than what most players ever experience. Deep in its early design stages, Miyamoto and his team were interested in releasing something akin to an Zelda, which would have been a sort of remix version of the original game. This concept eventually materialized in small ways through the Master Quest edition, but its origins were meant to be much grander, even imagining different dungeons entirely. While Master Quest only gave us mirrored and rearranged puzzles, the Whisper of Zelda suggests a whole shadow version of the game that never fully came to be. It lingers as one of the most enticing what-ifs in the series. Some players are fascinated by how Twilight Princess originally had a much darker filter applied across its world during the early trailer builds shown at E3. The final game, while still one of the darker toned entries in the series, actually softened its shadows and reduced its contrast by the time it released. This was partly due to Nintendo adjusting to the brightness preferences of the Wii hardware, which was aimed at being more family-friendly. Yet looking back at that early footage, you can feel the raw ambition of a Zelda that might have leaned even deeper into an unsettling, gothic aesthetic. One of the strangest details about Zelda's design legacy is how often Link's physical height changes between games. In some, such as Ocarina of Time, he stands tall, almost resembling a knight in training. In others, like Skyward Sword, he feels more youthful and almost cartoonishly lean. The developers never set a fixed canonical height, adjusting his appearance to match the atmosphere they wanted each adventure to evoke. It is a subtle but fascinating shift. Link is as tall or short as the story needs him to be, a living embodiment of adaptability across the eras. A small but curious piece of trivia lies in A Link to the Past, where many of the game's sprites actually include tiny, unused frames of animation. For instance, Link has unused facial expressions that never show in the final game. These hidden sprites suggest that the developers may have originally wanted to include more dynamic emotions, but trimmed them to fit within the memory limits of the cartridge. These discarded pieces of code rest silently in the background, ghostly remnants of possibilities left unseen by almost every player. When The Wind Waker was first shown, it famously divided the fan base. Yet what many don't realize is that the art style was not just chosen for visual experimentation. It was directly inspired by limitations. Nintendo realized that the GameCube hardware could more elegantly handle expressive, fluid characters in cel-shaded form than it could with hyper-realistic models at the time. This decision allowed the animators to craft Link's enormous range of expressive faces, from outrage to joy, which in turn opened the door to storytelling that leaned into humor and whimsy. Thus, what at first seemed like a controversial artistic gamble ended up becoming a timeless design choice. Another detail lies in the quiet background characters of Zelda towns. In Majora's Mask, every single character has a name, a story, and a routine, making Clocktown feel alive in a way few games had ever achieved at the time. What is haunting is how many of these characters were created by slightly altering models from Ocarina of Time. In one way, they are echoes of familiar faces, reshaped into strangers. This adds a subtle dreamlike quality to the game, as if the entire land of Termina itself is built from memories of Hyrule, stretched into eerie new patterns. There is a surprising connection between Skyward Sword, and Breath of the Wild hidden in the details of the Sheikah technology. Fans who studied the ancient symbols in Skyward Sword noticed how they resemble the motifs that later appear in the Sheikah slate and shrines in Breath of the Wild. It is as if the seeds of technological magic planted in the earlier game finally sprouted centuries later in the timeline. What began as floating, mysterious contraptions in the clouds eventually matured into the blue glow of forgotten machines buried across Hyrule. In the Japanese version of The Legend of Zelda for the NES, the instruction manual makes curious references that were never fully translated into the English release. Some descriptions of enemies included strange poetic notes, calling certain creatures phantoms born of hatred, or spirits who walk when the moon is gone. These darker phrasings were lightened or removed for the Western market, leaving a slightly sanitized impression. Yet if you read the original Japanese text, you find hints of a tone that leans far more into the realm of ghost stories than heroic fantasy. A little-known fact is that Breath of the Wild's horses have hidden personality traits coded into them beyond their visible stats. Some horses are more easily startled, others resist taming more stubbornly, and some bond with Link at a faster rate than others, even if their stats appear identical. Players who felt a particular connection to one horse over another may have unknowingly been experiencing these subtle variations. It's a testament to how much care went into making the animals feel alive, even when the systems behind them are invisible. The Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons games hold a fascinating secret. They were originally planned to be a trilogy of games, not just two. The third game, sometimes referred to as Oracle of Secrets, was meant to complete a trinity inspired by the three pieces of the Triforce. Development complexities and link system issues caused Capcom and Nintendo to scale the project back to two, but the idea of a lost third Oracle game lingers as one of the series' most tantalizing missed opportunities. Within Breath of the Wild, there is a strange glitch that allows Link to launch himself across the sky using stasis on objects like metal boxes or tree trunks. While this became a playful exploit for speedrunners, it's interesting to note that developers have mentioned they were aware of players discovering such physics quirks, but chose to leave them in deliberately. They saw the joy of players bending the world's systems in creative ways as a natural extension of the freedom the game was meant to embody. Thus, what might have been considered a bug in another franchise became an intentional gift to the community. Few fans realized that the soundtrack of Majora's Mask was composed under immense time pressure. Koji Kondo and the sound team had only about a year to produce the game's eerie melodies compared to much longer cycles for other titles. This rush may explain why some songs in Majora's Mask are twisted or inverted versions of tunes from Ocarina of Time. Rather than feeling recycled, however, this approach created a haunting familiarity, as if the music itself had been warped by the cursed three-day cycle of Termina. The dungeons of Link's Awakening contain one of the most playful secrets in the series, enemies and objects that reference other Nintendo games. From Goombas to piranha plants, the island seems to borrow creatures from Mario's world. What makes this more surreal is the dreamlike premise of the game itself, since Koholint Island is not a real place, but rather a creation of the Windfish's dream. These crossovers make perfect sense, memories of other Nintendo adventures bleeding into Link's subconscious. In the adventure of Link, townsfolk sometimes say lines that feel oddly cryptic, like, "I am error." While this became a famous meme, it actually originates from a mistranslation of a character's name. In Japanese, the character's name is closer to Errol, meant as a normal NPC identifier. Yet the mistranslation turned him into a legendary oddity, embodying the strange, sometimes accidental charm of early localization quirks. Deep in Twilight Princess, there is an optional mini-boss called Death Sword, a cursed phantom sealed within the Arbiter's grounds. What makes this battle chilling is not just the design of the skeletal beast, but the fact that if you linger in the chamber before the fight, you can hear whispers in reverse audio. Developers inserted actual distorted chanting into the game files to create a mood of dread, and most players never even pause long enough to notice. It's one of those small, chilling details that elevate the atmosphere without drawing direct attention to itself. The Wind Waker includes an unused island hidden in the game's code, often referred to by fans as Test Island. This location was never meant to be seen, functioning instead as a sandbox where developers tested collision, physics, and enemy placement. Yet for those who managed to access it, Test Island reveals the bare skeleton of how Hyrule's sea was built, a behind-the-scenes glimpse into the invisible scaffolding of creation. Even within Breath of the Wild, the most expansive Zelda to date, there are entire lines of NPC dialogue that almost no one hears. Many villagers have conversations that only trigger if you stand in the right place at the right time of day, and some require unusually rare weather conditions. These hidden exchanges give depth to the people of Hyrule, but most players never stumble across them, leaving them as whispered fragments of life carried by the wind. And then there is the curious case of Link never speaking. While his silence is often explained as a way for players to project themselves onto him, the developers have occasionally toyed with the idea of giving him a voice. Early drafts of certain games included short lines of dialogue for Link, but they were always scrapped out of fear that fans would reject hearing him speak. Instead, Link communicates with grunts, gasps, and determined yells, sounds that convey emotion without shattering the illusion of the silent hero. As Wave 8 drifts to its closing rhythm, the collection of these obscurities feels like sitting around a campfire of secrets, hearing tales not meant for the daylight, but for quiet moments before dreams. They remind us that Zelda is not just a series of games, but a living tapestry, stitched together from hidden codes, design choices, cultural echoes, and fan interpretations. Each obscure fact is like a star, small on its own, but Wave 9 arrives like the quiet hours just before dawn, when the world is hushed and shadows stretch long, and the forgotten corners of Zelda's history feel ready to be shared once more. At this point, the obscure trivia feels less like facts and more like hidden fragments of a dream tapestry, pulled from corners of cartridges, design notebooks, and stories passed between fans. As you listen, imagine this wave like drifting further into the night, each fact not just information, but a soft step into the mysteries behind the games. A secret that many don't know lies in the very earliest design sketches of the original Legend of Zelda on the Famicom disk system. In those drawings, Link was sometimes depicted with antennas, giving him a slightly more insect-like silhouette. This was not meant to be his final design, but was part of a brainstorming process, where Nintendo considered making him an alien visitor rather than a medieval-style hero. Though this idea never took hold, the playful thought of Link as something otherworldly hints at how different the series might have been. By the time the design was finalized, they chose the green tunic and a pointed hat, grounding him in the fantasy style we recognize. But those little antenna sketches still float in archives, reminders of a stranger path untaken. Another fascinating detail involves Majora's Mask and its unsettling soundtrack. Many fans notice the way the game's music grows more anxious as the moon draws closer to crashing down. But what's less known is that some of the tracks subtly speed up by fractions of a second as each day passes. This isn't just psychological, it's coded into the game itself. The tempo of Clocktown's theme slightly shifts as the cycle advances, creating subconscious tension in the player. It is not enough to notice immediately, but your body feels the increasing pace, adding to the sense of dread. It is one of those invisible tricks of sound design that changes the mood without ever calling attention to itself. Hidden within Twilight Princess, there is a small alcove in the fishing hut that contains a framed photograph of the game's developers. This Easter egg is almost impossible to stumble upon unless you explore the hut carefully. Yet it stands as a secret signature from the creators. By including a real-world image inside a fantasy universe, the developers broke the fourth wall in the most subtle way possible, leaving their own mark in Hyrule's waters as if to say, "We were here." It blurs the line between game and reality, a photograph of people who built a world hidden inside that very world. Few fans realize that Ocarina of Time's temples were at one point designed with different elemental structures than the ones we know. Early documentation reveals that instead of the forest, fire, water, shadow, spirit, and light sequence, the team initially considered wind and ice temples as part of the adult portion of the quest. Fragments of these ideas linger in the game. Unused assets point toward puzzles involving stronger wind currents and ice blocks. While some of these concepts resurfaced later in Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, the knowledge that Ocarina could have taken players through an entirely different set of elemental challenges makes the final version feel like only one of several possible branches of destiny. Another obscure yet poetic fact is that the Triforce, Zelda's most iconic symbol, was inspired by an actual historical emblem from Japanese culture. The symbol closely resembles the crest of the Hojo clan, a powerful samurai family in the 13th century. This crest, known as the Mitsuroko, or Three Scales, symbolized protection and unity. Shigeru Miyamoto and the design team borrowed this ancient imagery to serve as the magical relic of balance in Hyrule. Thus, every time we see the Triforce, we are not only seeing a symbol of Nintendo's fantasy, but also a reflection of Japan's medieval history shining through into modern myth. One of the strangest inclusions in the Wind Waker is a little-known message hidden inside the game's coding language. Developers left notes in Japanese characters within unused text strings that translate roughly to "thank you for playing." Unlike traditional credits, this message cannot be seen during normal play and was more likely a signature to one another during the debugging process. It is invisible to the casual fan, yet to anyone digging into the game's code, it feels like finding a whisper from the past, a secret gratitude preserved in lines of unseen programming. The Oracle games hold another quirk in their link system that connects them. When players complete one Oracle game and then use a password to carry their progress into the other, characters and endings shift slightly to reflect continuity. But tucked away in this system are rare dialogues that only appear if you perform unusual chains of actions in one game before linking to the next. These tiny narrative nods reveal hidden connections between characters across Holodrum and Labrina, like a hidden conversation where Impa remarks differently if she remembers the events of the other Oracle title. These lines are so obscure that only players who experimented with every Link variation could ever see them. In Breath of the Wild, the developers took inspiration for its cooking system from real-world culinary philosophies. One developer mentioned in an interview that the random success or failure of recipes was loosely based on the idea of home cooking spirit, meaning that not every meal needs to be perfect to bring joy. The silly, failed meals, black, gooey dishes, that appear with the title dubious food were deliberately inserted to reflect this playful imperfection. Even in a game where survival mechanics could have leaned toward harshness, the cooking system instead embraced warmth, humor, and humanity. Perhaps one of the darkest bits of hidden Zelda lore comes from Majora's Mask. Within the code lies a scrapped enemy known to fans as the Stalchild Giant. This unused creature is a towering skeletal figure that seems to have been cut before a final release. What makes it chilling is the implication of what Termina might have originally looked like if more undead giants roamed its cursed land. Though the creature never manifests in the finished game, just knowing it was conceived gives Termina an even more sinister atmosphere, hinting at horrors buried beneath the mask's already unsettling surface. Even more unusual is a fact about the Legend of Zelda: Four Swords Adventures. In one stage, players can find a reference to an unused enemy from A Link to the Past, buried deep within the sprites. It is a minor visual relic that never shows up naturally during gameplay, yet its presence demonstrates how development teams often recycled or hid away assets, almost as if to keep them preserved in case they wanted to resurrect them later. To the few data miners who uncovered it, it feels like stumbling into a fossilized creature sealed within the layers of Zelda's code. Another obscure detail comes from Skyward Sword. During its development, Nintendo toyed with giving Link the ability to directly speak to Fi using short voice commands picked up by the Wii's microphone accessory. This would have allowed players to call out for advice instead of pressing buttons. The system was abandoned due to inconsistent recognition, but the very idea of interacting with your companion through spoken voice feels eerily futuristic. It almost makes one wonder how Zelda might evolve in the future if one day Link's silence is contrasted by the player's real-world voice bridging into the game. A strange secret lingers in Breath of the Wild's Hyrule Castle. If you scale into certain out-of-bounds geometry, there are textured walls that resemble early builds of dungeon-like corridors, suggesting that the castle may have once been intended to hold a larger, more traditional dungeon layout before being streamlined into the open-ended final version. It is as if pieces of an unused dungeon still haunt the castle, hidden just beyond the boundaries of where you are meant to travel. In Link's Awakening, the original Game Boy version contained an odd quirk involving the trendy game minigame. If players timed their movements in a certain glitchy way, the claw could grab multiple prizes at once, causing bizarre results like overlapping sprites or objects appearing where they shouldn't. While many thought this was simply a bug, some developers admitted in later commentary that they left it intentionally, knowing players would discover it and laugh at the absurdity. It was a way of breaking the rigid seriousness of puzzles and reminding players that fun sometimes comes from the unexpected. The Mask Shop from Ocarina of Time has its own strange secret. The Happy Mask salesman's character design was modeled partly after a developer on the team, with exaggerated gestures added to make him stand out. But the most chilling part is that his sudden expressions of rage, his twisted, angry face, were drawn from photographs of real people making sharp, distorted grimaces. These photos were scanned and digitized, creating his eerie mood swings that unsettled players. His uncanny presence becomes even more unnerving once you realize it is rooted in real-world faces frozen in moments of exaggerated fury. Another overlooked gem comes from the Wind Waker's sailing mechanics. Early prototypes actually included a full day-night cycle where wind shifted unpredictably, making navigation more challenging. The final game instead gave players the ability to control wind direction with the Wind Waker baton, simplifying exploration to avoid frustration. But somewhere in the game's DNA exists the shadow of a harsher ocean, one where Link might have been truly at the mercy of storms and random currents, transforming the experience into a survival-like journey rather than an adventure of free exploration. In Majora's Mask, a particular unused file name references something called the Secret Seaside House. No building like this exists in the final game, though some fans theorize it was meant to be a location near Great Bay, possibly an inn or residence. Its absence adds to the dreamlike quality of Termina, as if pieces of the world flickered in and out of existence during development, leaving ghostly traces behind in code. We are left only with the name of a house that never stood, yet in some way still exists in the shadows of the game's data. Closing wave. 9 feels like walking through a hidden museum where the exhibits are not polished artifacts, but fragments, discarded sketches, and whispers of what could have been. Every paragraph of trivia feels like opening a locked drawer and discovering strange relics left behind by developers, storytellers, and dreamers. These are not the loud facts or the celebrated ones, but the quiet murmurs that remind us Zelda is as much about mysteries as it is about quests. The deeper you dig, the more you realize that Hyrule and its many worlds are not just games. They are living legends shaped by countless unseen hands, with secrets that continue to breathe long after players sit down the controller. Wave 10 drifts in like the final lantern glowing on a quiet path through Hyrule. At this point, the obscurities we've uncovered feel like fragments of a dream, each fact a little candle flickering against the vast shadow of history. This wave is where we gather the last handful of secrets, oddities, and whispers, and then step softly into the conclusion of this journey through forgotten Zelda lore. Let us settle into this last set of mysteries, not as a checklist, but as a gentle procession, winding toward a final farewell. There is an intriguing mystery hidden in the original Legend of Zelda that involves the second quest. Most players know that typing Zelda as a name activates a harder version of the game, but few realize how deeply this second quest was intertwined with the game's design. Miyamoto and his team, after finishing the original maps, realized they had spare memory left on the cartridge. Instead of leaving it empty, they filled it with a remixed set of dungeons and secrets, essentially doubling the game's length. What makes this obscure is that they never advertised it heavily. It was simply there, waiting for players to discover. For some children in the 1980s, finding out there was a hidden second game felt like stumbling onto another world that Nintendo never even told them about. One of the rarest curiosities appears in Majora's Mask 3D, the remake for the Nintendo 3 Deciseconds. In this version, a tiny set of characters were given new animations, including the bomb shop's shopkeeper, who now occasionally hums to himself. This little detail never existed in the original N64 release, and it is so minor that most players never notice it. But it reveals how the developers sprinkled extra life into the remake, almost as if Termina itself gained subtle new rhythms in its remade form. These minute touches create a sense of déjà vu. The world feels familiar but slightly altered, like returning to a dream that doesn't quite play out the same way twice. A strange Easter egg exists in Breath of the Wild regarding dogs. Players know that feeding dogs meat or apples can earn hidden treasures, But what isn't well known is that each dog has a subtle preference coded into them. Some dogs are more likely to reward you after fewer feedings, while others require more patience. This behavior was not explained in any manual or guide. It was meant to be felt rather than quantified, encouraging players to treat each dog as an individual companion. For those who fed every dog in the game, this small variation gave the illusion of personality, making each animal feel like more than just a repeating AI. Another little-known fact comes from the Wind Waker HD. While the remake is celebrated for its streamlined sailing and faster pacing, it also hides a new reference within the opening tapestry scene. The tapestry, which recounts Hyrule's forgotten history, contains an extra figure holding a staff who was not present in the original GameCube version. The developers never publicly explained this addition, but some fans theorize it could be a nod to sages or even an early concept for Hylia herself. It is such a subtle alteration that most people who played both versions never realized the tapestry had been edited at all. In Link's Awakening, particularly in the DX version for Game Boy Color, there is a hidden photograph shop where the photographer takes snapshots of Link during humorous or embarrassing moments. What's obscure is that some of these photographs only appear if you perform specific odd actions, like trying to steal from the shopkeeper or bumping into Marin repeatedly. Because these photographs could be printed with the Game Boy printer, they now exist as one of the strangest Zelda collectibles. Physical, paper mementos from a dream island that no longer exist in modern re-releases. The idea that you could once hold a real photo from a dream in your hand is one of those quietly magical quirks of old Nintendo hardware. There is a chilling quirk in Twilight Princess. If you spend too much time idling in certain locations while transformed into wolf form, faint howls of other wolves can sometimes be heard in the background. Most assume these are just ambient sound effects, but they are unique to Wolf Link's form and do not play otherwise. This has led to speculation that the developers inserted them as ghostly reminders of a pack that no longer exists, emphasizing Wolf Link's loneliness. Whether intentional or coincidental, the effect leaves an eerie impression, one that few players stumble upon unless they pause in silence long enough to hear the voices of unseen canines in the wind. The mask collection from Majora's Mask also hides small touches of personality. For example, if you wear the captain's hat near certain style children, their dialogue changes in ways most players never fully explore. They treat Link with military respect, calling him captain and awaiting orders. While this is necessary for progression in some areas, there are additional lines of dialogue that occur only under highly specific circumstances, where they acknowledge things about the moon's fall or Termine cursed state. These obscure lines add an extra layer of life to otherwise minor enemies, making even the undead soldiers feel bound to the narrative of impending doom. Another secret lives in Skyward Sword. The pumpkin-pulling minigame at the Lumpy Pumpkin Tavern has an unused prize coded into it, a reference to a special pumpkin dish. The dish never appears in the final game, but the text describing it remains buried in the files. This suggests that the minigame may once have included additional rewards, making the tavern feel more like a restaurant with rotating items. In the final release, this piece was dropped, leaving only fragments of text to hint at what might have been. There is an obscure design quirk in Ocarina of Time's Lost Woods. While most players assume the forest's endless looping paths are coded randomly, they are, in fact, subtly tied to Link's angle of entry. Depending on how you walk into each section, The game will sometimes favor one path over another, quietly guiding you without making it obvious. This invisible hand ensures that players rarely get stuck for too long, though it still feels like a maze. It is a clever compromise between making the woods feel confusing while secretly steering you toward eventual progress. An unusual Easter egg appears in A Link Between Worlds, where Ravio's shop contains masks and trinkets referencing past Zelda games. What's particularly obscure is the placement of a Majora's Mask hanging on the wall. This mask cannot be interacted with, nor does it serve any purpose, but its silent presence is enough to send fans spiraling into speculation. It feels like a quiet acknowledgement that Termina still exists somewhere, even if only as a distant echo. Nintendo often uses these small decorative nods as breadcrumbs, connecting eras without spelling anything out directly. One of the quirkiest development secrets comes from Breath of the Wild. To test climbing mechanics, developers created an enormous test level where every wall was climbable, littered with random blocks, towers, and platforms. This environment was never intended for players, but was shown briefly in developer presentations years later. It looked less like Hyrule and more like an abstract training ground, almost like something out of Super Mario Maker. From this chaotic prototype world, the entire climbing system of Breath of the Wild was born. It shows how sometimes vast freedom in the final game begins in controlled but surreal spaces. Even stranger is the fact that in Majora's Mask, some early concept art depicts Termina's moon not with a face, but with cracks and glowing eyes. The infamous grimacing moon we know today was a later decision, meant to lean into grotesque surrealism. The early version looked more like a falling meteor than a living entity. This decision to give the moon an expressive face turned it into one of the most iconic images in Zelda history. But tucked away in old artwork are visions of a more silent, less horrifying celestial body, one that might not have been remembered quite as vividly if it had remained unchanged. Perhaps the most unusual curiosity of all lies not within the games themselves, but in the Legend of Zelda cartoon from 1989. While most fans remember it for Link's infamous catchphrase, "Excuse me, princess," what is lesser known is that Nintendo briefly considered tying elements of the cartoon back into the games. Early design notes for later Zelda projects mention animated Link mannerisms, referencing the cartoon's exaggerated gestures. Ultimately, they abandoned this idea, but for a moment in time, there was a chance that the campy, over-the-top Link of television could have bled into the canon of the games. As we move gently toward the end of this wave, the obscure secrets begin to feel like fragments of dreams fading before sunrise. We've uncovered ghosts of scrapped temples, hidden dialogue, forgotten art, and secret signatures left by developers across decades. Each fact is a reminder that Zelda is not just a series of polished adventures, but a living, evolving myth full of abandoned threads and playful experiments. The conclusion of this long episode feels less like an ending and more like resting at a campfire after a long journey. Across 10 waves, we have traveled through forests of trivia, oceans of forgotten Easter eggs, mountains of unused data, and skies of dreamlike possibilities. Each fact has been a lantern lighting our way through Zelda's hidden corridors. And as this final wave settles, it becomes clear that the beauty of Zelda is not just in what we see, but in what remains unseen. The mysteries that linger, the secrets half buried in code, the design sketches of worlds that never came to be. All of these form part of the legend. They remind us that the series itself is alive, constantly shifting, filled with echoes of what was and whispers of what might come next. So let Wave 10 close like the final note of a lullaby. The obscure Zelda facts have been gathered, shared, and gently placed into memory. May they guide you into a dreamscape where you too can wander through forests, sail over oceans, and uncover secrets tucked away in corners just beyond the ordinary path. And as your eyes grow heavy, may you carry with you the comforting thought that Hyrule, with all its mysteries, will always be waiting for you to return.